We've already seen gods and goddesses play very central roles throughout our discussion of Hinduism. For example, even in the earliest portions of the Vedas, the hymns and the ritual treatises, we saw the importance of praising and petitioning the gods and goddesses for this worldly blessings in order to achieve health and happiness and prosperity in this life. We also, just in the last video, saw Krishna introduce this idea where deities can also have an impact on our spiritual journey toward moksha, right? In the Upanishads, it was all about us kind of achieving this transformative spiritual wisdom. But now in the Bhagavad Gita, the idea is that the deities can assist us through grace in order to help us reach salvation or liberation. So in this video, I just want to talk a little bit more about the roles of the gods and goddesses as Hinduism is becoming really what it will be all the way until this day. So we're kind of talking here about some of the deities and the concepts of the deities that are forming during the period of classical Hinduism. Often this is during the Gupta period, during some of the middle part of the first millennium of the Common Era. This is also where a lot of those Puranas are showing up. Remember, the second group of Smriti texts, the stories or the tales of the gods and goddesses that are being circulated as people are having more interest in their chosen deities and in the deities that can help us both in this life and in our spiritual quest. So one concept that I want to start this discussion with is the notion of the Trimurti. Right? You can see this Sanskrit term here. A lot of people sometimes relate this to the Christian notion of the Trinity. I'm not sure that's really all that helpful to start mixing and matching very kind of unique spiritual concepts in different religious traditions. Clearly, you have the notion of tri beginning each of these words, so three is going to be important. Here, we're talking about the three gods responsible for the cycles of creation and destruction. So again, this is different very much from what Christians understand by the Trinity as only being one God with three persons, Father, Son, and Spirit. Here you have these three unique gods who are sometimes represented as being combined as one, but they are three deities, three different names, who are responsible for the cycles of creation and destruction. That's always the way we think of the Trimurti. And here are their names and their particular roles. You have Brahma, the god of creation. Now pay attention, this is different from Brahman. Brahman has the N at the end of that term. Brahman is supreme being, reality itself, impersonal, no qualities or attributes. This is Brahma, a specific deity, the god of creation. So Brahma has qualities. Brahma is a male, for example, has the attribute of maleness. And we can represent Brahma through pictures. You can look up online pictures of Brahma and see visual representations. So make sure you keep those two words separate in your mind when learning about Hinduism. So Brahma is the god of creation, Vishnu is the god of preservation, and Shiva is the god of destruction. Now, this is a concept here, the Trimurti, that is a little tricky for Westerners sometimes. Westerners generally tend to think of the universe as kind of working along a linear line. There is one beginning and perhaps one end. In the East, time is often thought of in a cyclical fashion, which is why I said these are cycles of creation and destruction. The idea is that perhaps at a particular moment there is only Brahman, right? Reality itself, kind of absorbed into itself, and then Brahma, the god of creation, kind of is in charge of spitting everything out again back into all of the features of existence that we experience in the world around us. Vishnu then takes over as the god who preserves the universe as we experience, and then at a certain time Shiva comes along to destroy the universe as we know it, perhaps bringing everything back into Brahman, and then a new cycle begins with Brahma starting over with the work of creation. So this is a cyclical thing that happens over and over and over again. You can obviously imagine why this notion of the Trimurti becomes a very important concept in thinking about how the gods are perhaps in control or at least involved in the universe as we know it. It's a very important concept of three very important deities for the role that they play in the creation, preservation, and destruction of the universe as we experience it. Now, what's interesting is that as we kind of move from the Trimurti, we can see that two of these three deities end up being elevated in a very, very new way during this first millennium of the Common Era. And they are Vishnu and Shiva. A little bit interesting because from the West, we would think, well, the creation god is probably the one who should get elevated because that's a really big job. Yes, it's a big job, but interestingly, Brahma remains a relatively minor deity throughout most of Hinduism, right? Sure, he's the god of creation, but that's about it. You don't really worship Brahma beyond his role as the creator god, which he does at the beginning of each cycle of existence. Vishnu and Shiva, however, are elevated in a new way, along with Devi, who is perhaps we can call the goddess principal, right? So the other two, Vishnu and Shiva, male deities, Devi, the goddess principal. Therefore, many different goddesses are seen as forms of Devi, including Parvati. Parvati, who is listed here, is actually the consort of Shiva, kind of a partner, kind of a wife-like figure. Many of the male deities have these female consorts. So Brahma, for example, his female consort is is the goddess of learning, Sarasvati. And she ends up actually being more important on a day-to-day basis for many Hindus than Brahma, because if you're a student, you will pray to Sarasvati, the goddess of learning, perhaps before a test, in order to help your mind be sharp and to be successful in your studies. Vishnu's consort is Lakshmi, right? And she's very important in the relationship she has with Vishnu and is praised for a variety of reasons throughout many Hindu communities. But Shiva's consort Parvati becomes especially important here as one form of Devi. There are other forms, Kali I've listed here, Durga and others, but Parvati is perhaps the most popular form of the goddess principal, and she is the consort of Shiva. So these three deities, Vishnu, Shiva, and Parvati as the most frequent form of Devi, are elevated beyond simply having a role to play in the workings of our universe, to the level of being the supreme personal forms of Brahman, who are seen as more important than all of the other gods and goddesses, and therefore are worthy of our worship along the path of bhakti yoga. Remember, bhakti yoga introduced in the Gita, as I said, it would take a few hundred years for that concept to really circulate among the Hindu communities. And when it does, these are the three deities that different Hindus will elevate as their particular deity of choice, who is the supreme personal form of Brahman, worthy of our devotion, able to provide grace to assist us on our spiritual journey. So the idea is that you'll only really choose one deity as your supreme personal form of Brahman. Brahman is impersonal, but the deities are so close to Brahman in a sense because they are elevated forms of reality that they can represent Brahman to us in a more personal form, making it much easier than following kind of the path of the Upanishads, where we have to try to figure out reality in its impersonal form. So, for example, you will have the Vaishnavas. These will be Hindus who, for them, elevate Vishnu as the supreme personal form of Brahman, worthy of devotion on the path of devotion, and therefore able to provide grace to assist us in reaching moksha. Right? Now, they don't deny the reality of Shiva or Parvati. Of course, the Vaishnavas would say that Shiva remains the god of destruction, a very important member of the Trimurti. But for them, Vishnu is more important because he is elevated to this special level. For them, Vishnu is actually in control of all of the other deities. So even within the Trimurti, for them, it would be Vishnu who actually tells Brahma when it is time to create and is in charge of Shiva when it is time to destroy. And for them, you worship Vishnu not just as the preserver of the universe, but as the savior, as the redeemer of our souls by granting us grace through bhakti yoga. Or you could be a Shaiva. And if you're part of the Shaiva community, Shiva is elevated as the supreme personal form of Brahman. Of course, you acknowledge the existence of Vishnu as the god of preservation and acknowledge a lot of the things that Vishnu has done. And yet, Shiva, for you, is the god to worship along the path of bhakti yoga in order to receive grace, and is the one who is seen as in charge of really everything that occurs. Or You could be a Shakta. You could be a member of the community that follows the goddess in her many forms, most popularly Parvati. And for you, again, that would mean that yes, Shiva exists, yes, Vishnu exists, but you worship the goddess, especially in the form of Parvati, as the supreme personal form of Brahman in order to receive her grace, to cleanse your soul of karma, to lead you closer and closer to moksha. So again, this is all kind of following on the heels of the Bhagavad Gita and the introduction of Bhakti Yoga. And these are the deities that start to be viewed as not just having a role to play in our day-to-day lives, not just granting us health and happiness, like has always been the case for the Hindu gods and goddesses since the earliest days of the Vedas. But now they have this role to play on our spiritual journey. And it becomes very, very significant for particular communities. And to this day, many, many Hindus will consider themselves members of one of these three communities, the Vaishnavas, the Shaivas, or the Shaktas, in thinking about which deity for them represents the supreme personal form of Brahman, worthy of our worship along the path of devotion, Bhakti Yoga, in order to receive their grace to lead us closer and closer to moksha.